Tracking long pans. All of our data is continually moving in and out of frame, so there's nothing constant for us to rely on when creating a track. That makes this type of shot a bit tricky to track, right? Well, not necessarily. I'm Axel Wilkinson for HitFilm.com, and I'm going to show you how easy it is to track panning shots in Mocha HitFilm. Keep in mind that for a pan-tilt-zoom shot, where our camera is fixed in one position, we only need one plane tracked to get a camera solve. If the camera's position isn't changing, then there will be no perspective shift in the scene. So if we were to take this scene and make a matte painting of the entire scene, and then pan our camera across the matte painting to replicate this shot, the results would basically be the same as what we see in this video. In fact, I took a series of still images at this same location and then stitched them into a panoramic image and imported that into HitFilm. Then I used the camera in HitFilm to simulate a panning shot, and you can see the results here compared to our actual video footage. Hopefully this makes it clear that as long as the camera's position is not changing, all it's doing is turning in place, then all of the data in the scene is really only one plane as far as Mocha is concerned. These cars in the foreground, the clouds in the background, the buildings in between. As far as Mocha is concerned, this is all just like that matte painting we set up in HitFilm. It's all one plane, so we can track it pretty easily. The trick to tracking a long pan like this is to unlink the track layer from its tracking data. To see how we do this, let's just draw a big spline in the middle of our footage. It doesn't really matter the exact size or shape, as we'll see later. And I'm going to set the minimum percent pixels to 90. I'm going to turn off shear, since we don't have any sort of shear or perspective involved here. And now if I track forward, you'll see that that spline is locked into place. It's moving right along with the footage, holding its position just like we would expect. But eventually, that spline would go out of frame. So I'm going to stop that. And in the layer properties, we'll use the link to track menu and choose none to unlink that spline from its tracking data. I'll move the playhead back to the beginning of the timeline and start this tracking again. And this time, in a moment, once the camera actually starts to move, notice that the spline does not move along with the footage there. The spline holds its position in the frame. It's still tracking the movement of our plane as it passes through our selected area, but since it's unlinked, our spline is never going to go out of frame. So no matter how long this pan is, we can track all the way through the pan in one go and easily get a solve for the entire shot. Now this is a bit different from the way that Mocha's planar tracker usually works, but we are still tracking a plane in this shot. But since the entire shot is one plane, the exact size and position of our spline don't really matter. We just need a big chunk of data from Mocha to keep track of. Of course, if you have things moving in your shot, like the occasional cars that are driving around here, then you want to try avoid those when you position your spline. Now I'm just going to let this track finish doing its thing, and I think while I wait, I am going to have a chocolate cupcake. I advise you to do the same. Okay, now our track is complete. Let's rename this layer to Pan Track, and now we can create new splines for specific features within our shot. The idea is to create these splines in the exact location that things need to be inserted back in HitFilm, so we can use the points created by the splines to place our effects. So I'm going to add a spline to the back of this truck. I'll tidy up these corners just to keep things nicely aligned. Let's rename this layer to Truck, and then in the layer properties, in the link to track menu, we will link it to the pan track. I'll add another spline onto this building, and I'm going to line it up with the top of this. It's not really necessary that we do this, but I like to keep things neat. But basically, for each of these splines, we're going to get a planar surface, which creates points back in HitFilm, and those points are what we're really after. So the exact shape of these splines doesn't really affect our shot. We just need the points in the right location. Let's rename this layer to Tower, and then we can link to track, choose Pan Track again. Now, when we pan through this scene, because these layers are all linked to that initial pan track, which covers the entire duration of the shot, our other splines stay perfectly locked into place as the camera moves. Even when they go out of frame, Mocha knows exactly where those layers need to be at all times. I'm going to add one more spline to this storefront here, which I'll use to position some buildings into a skyline right behind it. So I'm going to rename this layer to Skyline and link it to our pan track. So now all of those splines move nicely along with our initial track. There's a bit of footage at the beginning of this shot that I don't really need, so I'm going to adjust the in point to trim that off, probably around let's do frame 120. And I'll just set the in point there. But I'm doing this after we've already tracked the entire shot, so we know exactly how the camera's moving throughout the duration. Now I'm just telling Mocha to export just a portion of that. Okay, so now with all of our splines in place and moving as they should, we can solve our camera. So I'll select all of my layers. Since all of these are connected to the same single tracking data, I'll select them all, switch to the camera solver, and I know this is a pan tilt zoom shot, so I'll specify that. I can't remember if it was a 50mm or an 85mm lens. It was somewhere in there, so I'll enable both of those. I'll turn on zooming in case that becomes a factor, and I will click solve. Now it might take a minute for the solve to finish, so after that cupcake, I think I am going to help myself to a glass of milk. And again, I advise you to do the same. Okay, now our solve is done. We've got a quality of 99%. Very nice. And now we can make sure that all of our layers are selected and export that camera data to HitFilm. I will hit save. I'm going to call this panning. And now it's exported, ready for use in our HitFilm project. Okay, here we are in HitFilm. I'm going to import that composite shot. I'll select that, open it up, and here it is. We can trim our camera and media to the endpoint we created, and then we'll just tuck that all back into the start of the timeline. And you can see that now we have all of these points which are nicely locked in place as we pan through our scene. Ignore this one. This is just marking the center point of our video layer, which is also selected. And typically at this point, I would delete some of these points from the timeline just to keep things less crowded. So we have 5 points for each of those splines, and we really only need one. So I kept the center points and just deleted all the others from the timeline. Then we can import our other elements or create effects or whatever and parent them to those points to control their positioning. So here's a final version using the pre-baked cooking show model. Hey look, there's a finished one in the oven. Here you can see how I've used those points to add some buildings to the skyline back here. I animated those popping in. Pop, 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 like that. And of course those buildings, because they're parented in to the tracking data, stay locked perfectly in place there. As we go on, I added some damage to this tower, which I did by using the export frame command to create a still image of one frame from the original video. Then I opened that frame in Photoshop, repainted the tower to add a hole in the side and some other damage. Then I cut the tower out of the picture, re-imported that bit into HitFilm, and used the tracking data to lock it in place. I parented that image to the tower center point. Then in the controls, I tweaked the position just to get it perfectly aligned. But since I created the damaged version of the tower based on the original frame, I knew that I could get a perfect alignment just by tweaking that a little. And then I added some smoke coming out the hole in that building as well. Further down the timeline, I used the point on this truck to replace some signage on the building here, and then on the sides of the truck as well. And again, those layers are just parented to the truck center point, and then the position is adjusted as required. So you can use this technique to track any sort of pan you've got. Long pans, short pans, even whip pans with a lot of blur. For short pans, you may not find it necessary to unlink your track if you have something that's visible through the entire shot, but it can still be really handy to connect multiple layers to one tracked layer within Mocha to drive a number of points in different places. So, thank you for watching. Our series of tutorials for Mocha HitFilm will continue, so please stay tuned.